Great to see you. Welcome to the special broadcast as we continue our rolling coverage around the passing of Archbishop Desmond Tutu.
Indeed, and now we can bring you Angelo Fick. He is the Director of Research at the Auwal Socio-economic Research Institute. Angelo, always a pleasure. Your characterization, of this character.
Well, Desmond Tutu is the last of a certain kind of figure in South African political and social landscape. This is a man who's lived through much of the 20th century history, and not just as a witness, but as a participant, and brought a certain moral force to our understanding of the times we lived in, both in the 1960s, 70s, and 80s, but throughout the post-apartheid period remained not just as people in that cliched way talk about him, as the voice of conscience, but as an admonisher for us not to be complacent, not to sit on our laurels, and certainly to begin to see, often in very uncomfortable ways, reminding us to begin to see what was still wrong with the society in which we lived and which we were building.
In creating or building a new society, one is taken back to a time when he was greatly involved in bringing together at the table the ANC and the IFP. In contemporary times, we are reminded of him and his contribution for the right to assisted death, and quoting back in the day saying, "As a Christian, I believe in the sanctity of life and that death is a part of that life." Your reflection on this role that he played?
So again, he was a man, not just in his sense, the word, a man of faith, but he was also a man who could use words very persuasively and very, shall we say, revealingly for other people to begin to see something about themselves that they may not have wanted to see. And his broad vision embraced positions that were often heterodox, that were often difficult for institutions and the establishment to take on. His positions on homosexuals, his position on, as you point out, euthanasia, assisted suicide or death, his position on Tibet, and even in the last decade, his position on the governing party of the country that he lived in, and the country and the organization that he, in a sense, helped guide its way through a very difficult period of its own history in the 1980s, and then, as you point out, in its relationship with the IFP in the 1990s. This was a man who had absolutely no, shall we say, hesitation for excoriating criticisms of the powerful and sometimes even of himself. And this is, I think, something that many South Africans have for too long relied on for it to be somebody else to do it. And if there is one signal lesson in Archbishop Desmond Tutu's life, it is that there isn't somebody else, that you have to be that person at whatever the risk is or whatever the cost is. And he was also dedicated to praising others during their lifetimes and at their deaths when it mattered. He was, after all, the person who spoke so eloquently at the funerals of Steve Bantu Biko and of Robert Sobukwe. This is somebody who, again, was not just the witness to that history, but was an active participant to make sure that that history could be overturned and could be reimagined by millions of people, not just in South Africa, but elsewhere in the world. But he was very clear that we could not go on, not just then in apartheid South Africa, but in post-apartheid South Africa, that we could not go on without confronting the ugly truths of the lives we were building, were living, and the world we were making.
He dared to speak his truth, at least earlier on, speaking to Reverend Frank Chikana in terms of the role that he played at the TRC, saying it was a very painful moment, especially when he asked for Winnie Madikizela Mandela to speak a truth at that time. I'd like to get your reflection, not just the TRC, but also in the process of CODESA, his contribution.
So I think for many of us who are not of the same faith or belief system of Desmond Tutu, we at the time couldn't really understand, many of us, exactly where he was coming from and why his moral vision was so particular and infused the Truth and Reconciliation Commission as it did. But I think, in retrospect, some of us have had to revise some of our harsher opinions of the process of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission and recognize that for all its flaws, it remained and still remains an incomplete process, a process that we have to complete and should not rely just on one figure. I think it is important for us to recognize that the moral force that Desmond Tutu brought to the 1990s transition moment and later that post-transition analysis and look back and attempt to make sense of that horrible past in the Truth and Reconciliation Commission wasn't just a kind of superficial gesture of forgiveness or of superficial attempts to suture over the divisions. It was a profound insistence that you cannot make sense of any path towards the future if you did not come to some kind of terms with your past. And for him, that process lay in his religious faith. What I think failed in that process was the fact that so many other South Africans could so easily reject that process or not embrace it, but not find an analogous or similar process to come to terms with that history. And we, as he kept reminding us in the 20 or so years since that process concluded, we have so much unfinished business that we would really, it is now urgent for us to take up the baton, to go on with the struggles, the arguments, the positions that Archbishop Tutu held, and begin to really honor him by working our way towards a better society, the one that he urged us to build in the 1970s and 80s, the one that he continued to urge us to build in the post-millennial period. And therefore, it is not enough, perhaps, to honor him in words on a day like today, but it is important for South Africans of all shades, of all political beliefs, to realize that if you really want to honor the dead, it is important to take their words seriously and to take their actions seriously and to respond to those words and actions with words and actions of our own. And here I think it is important to recognize the broad and embracing vision and the intellectual capacity that Archbishop Desmond Tutu showed right up until the very end of his life.
You speak of an unfinished business that we need to take forward and certain battles, right? One is reminded of a battle of the Fees Must Fall movement. And in relation to him in 1955, when the then government introduced the Bantu Education Act, and him deciding that he could not participate in that system that wanted to repress black intellectuals or suffocate black voices intellectually, if you will. So when you speak of, us having used words or using words and that not being enough, what does then, South Africa, not just today but tomorrow, look like for you and I?
I think we're a country that has, for a long time, we have had to come to terms with the fact that people of a certain generation are going to die and pass out of the lived experience of the country we live in. It is important, to quote another figure who recently died, Joan Didion, that we let the dead be dead, that we honor them and that we mourn them and that we stand by those who mourn them more personally. But we cannot become a country of heroes who have only died. And this, I think, is an imperative, not just for the governing party, but the entire society. We cannot keep looking to the past for our good South Africans, for our best South Africans. Yes, Desmond Tutu was one among the best that we have produced here. But we have to pick up the baton and make the South Africans that we want to be and be those South Africans ourselves. We cannot continue to rely only on the past. Yes, we must be inspired by the past, as Desmond Tutu himself was. You mentioned the 1950s and his objection to the extension of the Bantu Education Act. And he was part of a group of people, including Z.K. Matthews, among others, who also very strongly objected to that. And we need to find in organization the processes, the spaces, and the other people who will help us unmake this greatly unequal society. I mean, in a speech in 1980, as early as 1980, he urged the white student body of the University of the Witwatersrand to put aside what he called lethargy and the apathy of affluence. And we live in a society that is economically unequal. And many of those in the governing party, many of those in the governing echelons of the society are guilty of the apathy of affluence. And may need to look to themselves as they praise Desmond Tutu, whether or not we, and I include myself here, are really in the position that we would like to be, where we have a country that we are building that isn't about the haves and the have-nots, but the included and the excluded, because that is the kind of society that Desmond Tutu spent so much of his life opposing. And in his funeral orations of for Robert Sobukwe and Steve Biko, he praised them for the gift of their lives. And his life was certainly a gift to us, and it would be a squandered gift if we simply celebrate his words and his life, but did not change the world to match those words and that life and that struggle. And that, I think, is a challenge for all of us, myself included, but particularly those who run this country, the administrators, the governors, the politicians, the business people, to begin to take a hard look at themselves and the society they are building, we are all building, and whether or not it matches what we say is the best of Desmond Tutu.
Angelo Fick, thank you very much for your reflections. He is the Director of Research at the Auwal Socio-economic Research Institute. Thank you.